"I can't live without a man," said the Apache girl. "The Cowboy's Choice Vertical Bar. Best Wild West Stories." Jack Colton pulled hard on the reins, his old horse kicking up a cloud of red dust. He saw it then, a body collapsed in the unforgiving red dust. It was a young Kiowa woman, her strong frame covered in dust and dried blood. Purple welts from a whip marked her shoulders and back, and her wrists were still bound with a strip of leather clear signs she had been tied up. Her breathing was shallow, and her chest rose and fell in faint, uneven motions. Jack leapt from his saddle and dropped to his knees beside her. The unforgiving heat radiated off the ground in shimmering waves, but colder still was the thought that flashed through his mind. This could be a trap. The Kiowa tribe had warned him more than once not to meddle in their affairs. He placed his hand on her neck. Her pulse was so faint, it felt like it might vanish at any second. If he left her here, the sun would kill her within a few hours. Gritting his teeth, Jack drew the knife from his belt and sliced through the leather binding. Then he hoisted her over his shoulder. She was heavy, like carrying a whole sack of grain, but he powered through and threw her across the horse's back. "Damn it," he muttered, kicking the reins. The horse bolted forward, red dust swirling in its wake. The scent of blood, sweat, and hot sand mixed in the air. Jack did not look back. If anyone was watching, they would know whose side he had chosen, and this time there would be no turning back. Jack galloped through the rickety wooden gate, rushing to the old barracks. He gently lowered her down, laying her on an old blanket spread beside the fireplace, then hurried to start a fire. Flickering yellow light danced across his sun-darkened, sweat-soaked face. He dragged over the wooden bucket and scooped what little water remained in the tank. Every sip of water during the dry season was worth its weight in gold, but Jack soaked a cloth and used it to wipe the dust and dried blood from her face. The pulse at her wrist was still faint, but at least she was alive. Jack had never been one to get tangled in other people's problems. A few years back, disease swept through this land and took his wife and 2 young sons. Since then, he had lived like a ghost, tending only to the parched land and his small herd of cattle. He stayed away from town and even farther away from the trouble that came with other people. But what he had done tonight shattered all of that. The woman before him, Ayanna, was unlike the Kiowa women he had seen before. Her body was powerful with bulging arms and broad shoulders like a warrior. The whip marks on her back told of a brutal punishment, likely for betraying tribal law. Jack knew one thing for certain. If the tribe found out he had taken her in, they would brand him an enemy. Outside, night was falling fast. Prairie winds swept sand through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying with them the lingering heat of the day. Jack threw more wood into the fire and dropped down beside Ayanna. The flames lit up his face, weathered, sun-scorched, with gray eyes that were cold but deep. He handed her the last bit of water in a small bowl. She parted her lips slightly, drank slowly, and then slipped into unconsciousness. Jack let out a heavy breath and pulled the rifle close, resting it within arm's reach. He leaned back against the wooden wall, eyes fixed on the door. He knew exactly what kind of people would leave a woman to die in the desert, and that they might return to finish what they started. And tonight, if they did, Jack Colton would be the one standing in the doorway. The fire in the hearth had faded, leaving only a bed of glowing embers. Jack dozed in his chair, the rifle resting across his lap. A faint, rustling sound snapped him awake. Ayanna. She pushed herself upright, her dark eyes wide and wild with panic. In an instant, her large hand snatched the small knife from beside the stove. Steel flashed in the firelight. Jack did not move. He slowly raised both hands, his voice low and gravelly. "If you are going to stab me, do it clean. But if you want to live, put the knife down." Ayanna was panting, sweat beading on her forehead. Her eyes darted around the cabin, small, old, but not a prison. Then to the man in front of her, tall, lean, unshaven, with eyes that were steady and cold. She hesitated. Jack kept his voice calm. "I cut your bonds. If you want to leave, that door is open. But out there is nothing but hot sand and vultures." The knife trembled in her grip. After a long pause, she let out a breath and dropped it to the floor. Her powerful body collapsed like a felled tree. Jack stepped forward, picked up the blade, and handed her the last bowl of water. "Drink. You need it more than I do." Ayanna took the bowl and drank in slow sips, her eyes never leaving Jack, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. Without another word, Jack stepped out onto the porch and sat on the edge of the steps, his rifle across his lap. Ayanna tilted her head, watching through the door. In the moonlight, the man's silhouette remained still as stone. The only movement, the faint wisps of smoke curling from his cigarette. That entire night, Ayanna did not sleep. Each time the nightmares came, she opened her eyes and saw Jack still there, never coming in, but never leaving either. A strange feeling began to stir in her chest, something she thought had died with her past, a sense of safety. By the time the sky began to pale, Jack had not moved. He simply turned his head and spoke quietly. "If you want to stay until you are strong again, you can. If you want to leave, I will not stop you. The choice is yours." Ayanna stared at him, then turned her face away. She said nothing, but her hand tightened around the blanket draped over her shoulders, and that was her answer. The sun rose, casting its light down on the weathered roof of the cabin. Ayanna could stand on her own now. She stepped out into the yard, her shoulder still roughly bandaged, but her gaze sharp and focused. Jack was fixing a broken section of fence, not bothering to look up. "You are stronger," he said in an even tone. "If you want to eat, there is a spot to haul water behind the cattle pen." Ayanna said nothing, but a moment later she picked up a wooden bucket and made her way to the water tank. Her thick, muscular arms flexed beneath sun-darkened skin as she pulled up the bucket. Jack glanced over, someone who had nearly died just the night before and was already strong enough to work. It caught him by surprise. That day, Ayanna said almost nothing, simply followed Jack in silence, watching how he patched the fence and mixed mud to repair the walls. As the afternoon faded and Jack finally paused to rest, she suddenly stepped forward, picked up the hammer, and finished driving in the last posts. Jack stood still for a moment, then gave a quiet nod and let her carry on. That evening, for the first time, Ayanna lit the kitchen fire without being asked. She cooked a simple rabbit stew and set it down in front of Jack without a word. He looked at the bowl, then at her. A silent nod was all the thanks he gave. In the days that followed, the cabin was no longer so quiet. The sound of hammers, shovels, and wood clashing together filled the air. Jack dug a new water hole. Ayanna hauled stones to block the wind. Her strength so great, she rebuilt an entire section of the fence in just one afternoon. One evening, as the sunlight faded, the two of them sat on the front porch. Jack lit a cigarette and Ayanna whittled a small knife. For the first time, she spoke. "Why did you save me?" Jack stared out at the cracked, dry fields. "Because I could not bear to see someone left out there. I have seen too much death." Ayanna was silent. After a moment, she nodded. A simple answer, but something inside her seemed to uncoil and loosen. That night, as the wind rustled through the old roof, Ayanna no longer tossed and turned. For the first time in months, she slept deeply. While outside the cabin, Jack's slow, steady footsteps circled the homestead. "Thank you for being here." If this story reminded you of days gone by, dusty sunsets, and the echo of hooves pounding in your heart, go ahead and subscribe to my channel so that each day we can sit together once more and I will tell you another story from the Wild West. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. That afternoon the sky turned into a harsh golden sheet, the kind of light that made every shadow sharp and every wrinkle of land look like the scar of an old wound. Jack was tightening the reins on his old horse when he heard the rhythm of hooves echoing faint but steady. His head snapped up. On the horizon, a faint trail of dust unfurled, curling upward against the molten sky. "Uninvited guests," Jack muttered under his breath. He reached for the Winchester, leaning against the porch post. The wood was warm from the sun, the metal cool against his hand. The weight of the gun was familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend he'd sworn he would never see again. Ayanna, inside mending a torn strip of cloth, heard the sound too. She stepped into the doorway. Her sharp eyes caught the dust cloud and froze. The muscle in her jaw tightened. Jack saw her hand drift toward the small knife she now carried at her side, as if it had grown there, as natural as breath. 3 riders approached, their horses moving at a controlled trot. The bandanas covering their faces turned them into faceless shadows. Dust clung to their boots, to their coats, to the guns at their hips. The horses' nostrils flared, snorting in the heat, hooves scattering pebbles across the yard. The rider in front nudged his horse forward. His voice was deep, flat, the kind of sound that carried the cold weight of command. "Our woman is here. Hand her over." Red. Ayanna stiffened, taking a step back. Her grip on the knife whitened her knuckles. She did not hide her fear, but behind it burned a different fire, rage, memory, and the stubborn will to still be standing after everything. Jack stepped forward, rifle raised but steady, his body forming a wall between the cabin and the riders. His voice was gravel dragged across stone. "She's injured. She has the right to stay here until she is healed." The second bandit spat into the dirt. His voice carried sharpness, a snarl more than word. "She has been cast out by the gang. She has no right to live on this land. If you shelter her, you become our enemy." The words settled heavy in the heat. Jack did not lower his rifle. His gray eyes, colder than steel, locked on theirs. "If you want to kill someone, you'll have to go through me first." Silence followed, taut as a drawn bow. The wind rose, kicking up swirls of red dust that clung to skin and stung eyes. Horses stamped, restless, as if they too sensed blood waiting on the edge of choice. Ayanna stood behind Jack, her heart hammering. For a flicker of a moment she remembered the last time she had stood before these men, her arms tied, her back whipped raw, her pride ripped from her like flesh from bone. She remembered their laughter when she refused to kneel to their leader, the sting of leather again and again until her legs gave out. That was why they had cast her out. Not for theft, not for betrayal, but for defiance. She would rather die than bow. And in their law, defiance was the worst crime of all. Now here was this weathered white man, his hair silvering, his face lined by grief and sun, standing in front of her as if her life mattered. Something inside her chest shifted, painfully, like a bone broken long ago that had never set right. The lead rider finally lowered his pistol. His eyes burned above the bandana. "We will return. Next time, we will not come alone." They yanked their reins and turned. The horses bolted, tails whipping as a trail of dust swallowed them. Silence fell heavy again, broken only by the faint hiss of wind against the dry grass. Ayanna's hand still clutched the knife. Jack turned, lowering his rifle but not his guard. His voice was quiet, but edged with steel. "They'll come back with more. If you still want to stay, we have to prepare." She nodded. No hesitation now. The fear was there, but it had been burned clean, leaving only determination. Her eyes held his with that same silent fire. She had chosen her ground. That night the cabin glowed with lantern light. Jack dragged every round of ammunition from his trunk, each one lined up like beads of a rosary. He checked the rifle's chamber, the revolver at his hip, even the old shotgun rusting in the corner. He had promised himself never again to live by the gun, not after burying his wife and sons. But promises made to ghosts break easy when the living stand in danger. Ayanna stood beside him, sleeves rolled up, helping without being asked. She moved with the sure strength of someone who had built things all her life, teepees, traps, shelters in the desert wind. She hauled sandbags from the shed, her muscles straining, and stacked them under the windows. She carried stones to weight the fence line. When Jack set up a firing slit, she was the one to measure its height against her shoulder. She was no longer just a refugee under his roof. She was standing with him. For hours they worked in silence, broken only by the scrape of wood, the clatter of nails, the grunt of effort. The night outside was vast and merciless, but inside the small ring of firelight, something else was being built. Not just defense, trust. At one point Jack paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at her across the lantern light. They'll likely come before dawn or the day after. Depends how much hate they carry. Ayanna set down the stone in her hands. They will come. They cannot allow me to live free. If I stand here, it makes them weak. Jack studied her. Her voice carried the weight of truth, spoken not in fear but in certainty. He nodded once, slowly. Then we'll make them regret underestimating us. Hours later, when the cabin was as fortified as they could manage, they sat on the porch. The stars overhead were sharp and endless, wheeling across the black. The desert wind carried the dry scent of sage and dust, rattling the loose boards of the fence. Jack lit a cigarette, the tip glowing like a lone ember against the dark. Ayanna sat beside him, knife resting across her lap. For a while neither spoke. Finally, Jack broke the silence. You don't owe me answers, but if we're going to stand against them together, I should know what brought you here. Ayanna's gaze stayed on the horizon, but her voice dropped low. I was born Kiowa, in the shadow of red canyons. My father was a horsebreaker, my mother a healer. I had brothers who hunted bison, sisters who wove hides. When the white men drove us from the buffalo, we turned to smaller herds. And when the land grew thin, some among us turned to raiding. The gang you saw men I once called brothers. They took me in after my parents died. I thought they were my blood. Her hands tightened around the knife, but their leader wanted me for himself. When I refused, they beat me until I could not stand. They left me in the desert, bound, for the sun and the vultures. That is why you found me there. Her words hung between them like smoke. Jack exhaled slowly. I lost my family too, wife and 2 boys. Fever took them. Since then I've kept to myself. No fights, no friends, just land and cattle. His jaw flexed, the cigarette burning low. I told myself it was better that way. Safer. But watching you, I don't know. Maybe a man can't live forever behind walls. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes catching the faint firelight. Walls break. Only hearts endure. For a long moment they looked at each other, 2 lives scarred in different ways, finding a strange symmetry. Then Jack stubbed out the cigarette and stood. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we finish the defenses. But Ayanna did not rest. All through the night she kept waking, listening to the sound of his boots, pacing outside the cabin, his shadow crossing the window with the steady rhythm of a man who knew death might come with the sunrise. At dawn, the desert was painted with copper light. Jack was already out by the fence, driving posts deeper, shoring up weak spots. Ayanna joined him wordlessly, hauling wood, stacking stone. They worked side by side until sweat streaked their faces, their arms shaking with effort. By midday the ranch looked less like a lonely homestead and more like a fortress. The cattle clustered nervously in the corral, sensing tension thick in the air. Even the old horse stamped restless, as if it too felt the coming storm. That evening they ate in silence, rabbit stew stretched thin, bread hardened from the heat. Neither complained. When the last bite was gone, Jack loaded the Winchester again. Ayanna sharpened her spear until the blade gleamed in the lantern light. They were ready, or as ready as 2 souls could be against the weight of many. Outside, coyotes howled into the endless dark. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The third evening came heavy, the horizon burning with a dull red haze, as if the desert itself knew what was coming. Jack Colton stood at the porch rail with his Winchester in hand. His knuckles were white around the rifle stock, his shoulders drawn tight as bowstrings. Behind him, Ayanna tied her black hair back with a strip of leather. The faint gleam of a knife caught the last rays of sun, and in her other hand she gripped a spear carved from mesquite wood, the head of it sharpened stone bound with rawhide. The silence broke with the first tremor underfoot. Then came the sound, hooves, not 3 or 4, but dozens. The earth itself seemed to quake. Jack's stomach clenched. He had fought in ambushes, skirmishes, bloody little wars that left graves scattered across Texas and New Mexico. But this felt different. This wasn't soldiers against soldiers. This was a tribunal, and he was standing inside the circle. Dust boiled up on the horizon. Nearly 20 riders emerged, their silhouettes black against the setting Sunday. They came hard, fast, then slowed as they neared the fence line. Their horses formed a ring so tight Jack could see the whites of the animals' eyes, nostrils flaring, foam flecking their bridles. They said nothing at first. Only the creak of saddle leather and the restless snort of horses filled the air. Then one man urged his stallion forward. He was broad-shouldered, scar carved deep across his cheek and down to the corner of his mouth, splitting his face into a sneer even when he did not smile. One eye clouded and white, the other black and sharp as obsidian. The stories Jack had heard whispered in dusty saloons carried a single name: Cade Blackthorn, warlord of the outlaw Kiowa band. Blackthorn's voice rasped through the silence. "Cowboy, you keep what is not yours. She was cast out. She belongs to the dust." Jack kept the rifle steady, though sweat traced cold lines down his back. "She's alive. That gives her the right to choose." A stir rippled through the riders. Some spat into the dirt. A younger man shouted, "She shamed us. She spat on her own blood. Her life is forfeit." Jack's finger brushed the trigger, but Ayanna stepped forward. The firelight of sunset caught the scars across her back, the raw marks of the whip. Her voice thundered across the ring. "I broke no law. I refused the bed of a tyrant. For that I was beaten and left to die, but my spirit was not broken. That is no crime." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Some of the riders shifted in their saddles, eyes darting toward Blackthorn. He studied her with his one good eye. "You would live here? Under the roof of a white man? Then you sever every tie to us." Ayanna lifted her chin. "I choose life. My life." Blackthorn raised his hand. "Then hear this. We ride tonight. But at dawn, we return with the full band. If you are still here, you are no longer of us. And you, Cowboy," his eye cut to Jack, "will bear the cost, the weight of her blood, and your own." He jerked the reins. The stallion reared, hooves striking sparks from the dry earth. Then he wheeled away. The circle broke. Thunder rolled as the riders vanished into the horizon, leaving only choking dust in their wake. Jack lowered his rifle slowly, every muscle screaming from the tension of holding it ready. The yard was empty now, but the silence felt crowded, haunted by the threat that still hung heavy in the air. Ayanna stood rigid, spear clutched so tight her knuckles whitened. Her chest heaved with each breath, but her eyes were alive with something beyond fear, defiance, maybe, or the first faint taste of freedom. "They'll be back," Jack said, voice low, matter of fact. She turned toward him. "Then we fight." Jack's jaw worked as if chewing words he didn't want to spit. He had fought before. He had buried his wife and sons because a fever came when he was out riding fence. He knew what it was to lose everything, and he knew what 20 riders at dawn meant. Yet he couldn't bring himself to tell her to leave. Not now. His gray eyes met hers. "Then we fight." The ranch became a fortress before the moon was high. Jack dragged old sandbags from the shed, stacking them at the windows. Ayanna split wood into stakes, jamming them deep into the ground as barricades. He filled every lantern with oil. She filled glass bottles with the same, shoving cloth into their mouths to make firebombs. Their hands were black with soot, their clothes clung with sweat, yet neither slowed, not once. By midnight, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a bunker. Shadows stretched long across the yard. The stars glittered cold and bright overhead, silent witnesses to the coming storm. Jack sat on the porch steps, Winchester across his knees. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing briefly before vanishing in the dark. Ayanna sat beside him, knife laid across her lap. "You could send me away," she said at last. Her voice was low, almost lost in the night wind. "If I go, they will not touch you." Jack exhaled smoke. "Sending you out there would be the same as shooting you myself. I don't kill women." Her eyes studied him. "Then why risk your life for me?" Jack stared at the horizon. "Because I've already buried too many." The words sat between them like stones. Neither spoke again. Neither slept. Dawn crawled over the horizon, bleeding red light into the sky. The first hoofbeats reached them before the sun had fully risen. Louder this time. Heavier. Jack counted under his breath. 50. Maybe more. Dust rose like a storm cloud. Horses filled the plain, circling the ranch until the horizon was nothing but bodies and dust. The circle opened. Blackthorn rode through, Scar shining in the morning light. But he was not alone. 2 elder women rode behind him, hair streaked gray, their faces carved by years of authority. The council. They dismounted, standing tall as stone. One spoke, her voice hard as flint. Ayanna, daughter of the Kiowa, today we ask for the last time. Return and face judgment, or remain in exile forever. Ayanna stepped forward. Her scars caught the light like brands. She no longer stood behind Jack. She stood beside him. Her voice was clear. I will not return. I choose life. My life, on my terms. Murmurs rippled through the riders. Some turned away, ashamed. Others gripped their weapons tighter. The second elder raised her hand. Then hear the sentence. From this day, your name is struck. You are no longer of our blood. You will not be buried in our soil. But no hand of ours will hunt you. Ayanna's breath shuddered out. Her shoulders trembled, but her eyes shone. But Blackthorn's voice cut sharp. Not enough. She chose the white man's roof. Her fate is bound to his. If she spills blood, he pays. If she defies us, he bleeds. Jack's rifle didn't move. His voice was steady. I understand. The council's gaze lingered, then turned away. One by one, the riders mounted and rode. Dust swallowed them. The silence they left was a different silence now, not a threat, but a sentence carried out. Ayanna sagged, chest heaving. Jack looked at her, gray eyes steady. You just chose a new life. Her voice was rough, but proud. No, I chose myself. Os Cruz. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on the battered cabin and the weary pair who stood before it. Jack set his rifle aside, feeling the tremor in his arms at last. Ayanna lowered her spear, fingers still trembling, not from weakness but from the weight of what she had severed. Neither spoke for a long while. The wind stirred, carrying dust across the yard. Jack finally broke the silence. You understand what this means. You're free, but you're cut from them forever. No burial, no name in their songs. Ayanna's jaw tightened. I would rather die nameless than live chained. He studied her a long moment, then nodded once. They turned back to the cabin together. The fire in the hearth had long gone out, but the embers still glowed faintly. Jack knelt, stirring them back to life. Ayanna crouched beside him, feeding kindling into the flames. The crackle of fire filled the silence, a fragile reminder that life went on, even here. Jack stared into the flames, voice low. I've seen men die for less, seen them lose everything they loved because they couldn't walk away. But you didn't walk away. You stood. Ayanna met his eyes. So did you. For the first time since the riders had gone, Jack's mouth twitched in something almost like a smile. The fire of dawn still burned across the horizon, a promise of battles yet to come. Jack and Ayanna stood in the yard, 2 figures against the vast plain stripped of past, bound only by choice. And though the dust was settling, the war inside them had only just begun. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The dust of their judgment still lingered in the yard long after the riders had gone. Jack Colton stood by the gate with his rifle resting across his shoulder, staring at the empty horizon, as if expecting the posse to come storming back. But there was no thunder of hooves now, only the faint whisper of the morning wind and the soft creak of the weathered fence. Behind him, Ayanna leaned against the porch post, her breath still uneven. Her dark eyes were fixed on the ground where the council had stood, where her name had been struck from the lineage of her people. She traced a scar on her forearm absently, the mark of the whip that had once torn her skin, as though reminding herself that the past was real and that she had survived it. Jack turned at last, his boots crunching over the dry earth. He studied her in silence for a moment. Then he spoke, voice gravelly but steady. You're free of them now. That's no small thing. Abu. Her jaw tightened. Freedom tastes like ash when it is won by exile. Jack nodded slowly. He understood that better than most. Exile wasn't always forced. Sometimes it was chosen. Sometimes it was both. He had been living in exile for years, self-imposed, punishing himself for not saving his wife and children when fever swept through the land. The ghosts of that failure had kept him chained as surely as iron. But now, standing in the morning light with Ayanna beside him, he felt the faint stir of something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of change. "We can't live like this," he said. "Waiting for them to return, waiting for the next storm. If you want to stay, we have to make this place stronger, safer, more than a bunker. It has to be a home." Ayanna lifted her head, eyes catching the sunlight. "Then we build." That day they set to work. Jack fetched his tools, the ones he had not touched since before his family died. The shovel's handle was worn smooth, the hammer scarred by years of nails driven into stubborn wood. He handed one to Ayanna without a word, and she gripped it with a strength that startled him. They began by clearing the yard. Old boards, half-broken fence posts, scraps of rusted metal all dragged into piles. Sweat poured down their faces, mixing with dust, but neither slowed. When the midday sun burned overhead, Jack stripped his shirt away, the muscles of his shoulders taut beneath sun-browned skin. Ayanna worked beside him, powerful arms flexing with each swing of the hammer. She carried stones heavier than Jack would have thought possible, stacking them to form a wall against the north wind. By late afternoon, the ranch already looked different. The yard, once a mess of neglect and ruin, was now a place of order. The fence line stood straighter. The earth was turned and ready for seed. They ate little that night, rabbit stew and hard bread, but it tasted better than any feast. For the first time, Jack felt a flicker of pride in the work of his hands again. For the first time since his family's graves, he had built something that mattered. That evening, as the sun bled crimson across the sky, they sat by a fire in the yard. The flames licked upward, sparks drifting into the night like tiny stars. Jack leaned back against a log, rifle across his knees. Ayanna sat opposite, sharpening her knife with slow, deliberate stroke. She broke the silence first. "Do you ever dream of them? The ones you lost?" Jack's hand froze on the rifle stock. His throat tightened. He hadn't spoken of his wife and sons in years. The memories were too raw, too heavy. But Ayanna's gaze was steady, not demanding, just waiting. "Yes," he said finally. His voice was low, rough as gravel. "Every night. Sometimes they're alive. Sometimes I'm burying them all over again. Either way, I wake up, and the cabin's still empty." Ayanna nodded, as if she knew that kind of emptiness. "I dream of my mother," she said softly. "She was strong, stronger than me. She taught me to fight, to hunt. When the council cast me out, I thought I had lost her too. But I still hear her voice when I raise my spear. I think she walks with me." The fire crackled between them. Jack's gray eyes softened. "Maybe that's all any of us can hope for. To carry the ones we lost, not let them vanish." Ayanna looked at him for a long moment, then gave a single, small nod. Days turned into weeks. The ranch transformed. Jack and Ayanna dug a trench from the old waterhole to the garden plot, lining it with stones so water would flow true. They built a new corral for the horse, stronger than the last, with posts sunk deep and bound tight. Jack taught Ayanna how to mend tack, how to patch leather, how to shoe a horse. In turn, she taught him how to read the sky for signs of rain, how to find cactus fruit and desert herbs that could heal wounds or ease fever. At first they spoke little, but slowly, words came easier. Ayanna's laugh, low, rough, rare, surprised Jack the first time he heard it. He found himself watching her as she worked, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she carried weight as if it were nothing. And sometimes, when dusk painted the land gold, he caught her watching him in return. One evening, after a long day hauling logs, Jack found Ayanna standing at the edge of the field, staring at the horizon. The sun was sinking, and her face was bathed in orange light. He walked up beside her. "What do you see?" She didn't turn. "I see a world I thought I had lost. A world where I am not hunted, not beaten, not left to die. I see," she hesitated, then said it, "I see a future." And Jack's chest tightened. For so long his future had been nothing but dust and graves. Hearing her speak of it as if it were real stirred something fierce in him. "A future," he repeated. The word tasted foreign on his tongue. She turned to him, eyes deep, unwavering. "Do you want one, Jack Colton?" His breath caught. He looked away toward the cabin, the fence, the work of their hands. "I thought I buried that part of myself. But maybe—" He met her gaze again. "Maybe I do." Then, the next morning the wind shifted. Clouds gathered on the far edge of the desert, dark and swollen. Jack smelled rain before he saw it. The storm would break by nightfall. He and Ayanna worked quickly, covering the woodpile, securing the animals. The first drops fell as thunder rolled across the plain. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened, rain hammering down in sheets. Ayanna stepped into the yard, lifting her face to the sky, arms spread wide. Water ran down her scars, washing dust and blood away. Jack watched from the porch, his heart aching with something he couldn't name. She looked like a woman reborn. He joined her. The rain drenched them both, soaking through shirt and skin, but neither cared. They stood together in the storm, two figures washed clean by the sky's mercy. For Jack it felt like baptism. For Ayanna it felt like freedom. When the storm passed, the land smelled of new earth. Jack built a fire in the yard, the wood hissing as it dried. He fetched iron from the shed-old horseshoes, rusted nails, scraps he had hoarded but never used. "We'll need a forge," he said. Together they built one from stone and clay. Ayanna pumped the bellows while Jack heated the iron. Sparks flew as he hammered the metal, shaping it into hinges, nails, new tools. His arms ached, sweat ran down his face, but he felt alive. Each strike of the hammer was a heartbeat, each glowing piece of iron proof that he was more than a ghost. Ayanna watched, eyes shining in the firelight. "You build not just for today, but for tomorrow." Jack paused, hammer raised, then lowered it slowly. He looked at her. Maybe tomorrow is worth building for. That night, they sat before the forge, embers glowing. Ayanna laid her spear aside, resting her hand on the rough wood of the porch. Jack lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward into the star-scattered sky. For the first time in years, Jack Colton felt the weight of the past begin to lift. For the first time since exile, Ayanna felt the ground solid beneath her feet. They had been cast out, beaten down, nearly broken, but together they had chosen life. And from the ashes of exile, they were forging something new. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. That afternoon, the sky turned pitch black without warning. After weeks of drought, the first drops of rain fell on the dusty roof of the cabin. The scent of wet earth rose thick in the air, as if the whole prairie was letting out a long, weary sigh. Jack stood on the porch, rain soaking through his shirt. He watched the cracked fields slowly soften under the falling water. Ayanna stepped out behind him, her dark hair wild in the wind, rain glistening on her muscular arms. "The storm came fast," Jack said, his voice rough. Ayanna said nothing. She stepped down from the porch, tilting her face to the sky. Eyes closed, rain mixed with dust and dried blood on her skin, washing away everything that was left of her past. Jack watched her for a long moment. She was no longer the abandoned woman he had found in the desert. Standing before him now was a warrior and a free human being. As the rain began to ease, Jack stepped out into the yard and stood beside her. The two of them stood in silence for a long time, listening to the steady patter of rain. "You can leave," Jack said slowly. "They will not hunt you anymore. The road south still leads to town." Ayanna turned to him, her eyes calm but deep. "And do you want me to leave?" Jack was quiet. Rain rolled down his sun-darkened face. Finally, he shook his head. "No. I think this ranch, it is no longer big enough for just one person." A faint smile crossed Ayanna's lips, the first true smile since the day he saved her. That whole afternoon, the two worked side by side, clearing the yard, turning over the soil, repairing the fence. Ayanna carried the heaviest logs. Jack drove the posts. By the time the sun broke through the clouds again, the ranch looked different, stronger, cleaner, and filled with the scent of new earth. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." When night came, Jack lit a fire in the yard. They sat beside it, watching the sparks drift into the dark sky. For the first time in years, Jack did not feel alone. Ayanna laid her spear on the ground, a silent promise. Jack lit a cigarette and smiled gently.